Would love for each of you to sort of introduce your background and sort of core beliefs. What have been the key shaping influences, either experiences, persons, and or institutions in the lens that you find yourself wearing today? Alan, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Anne, and it's a privilege and pleasure to join this Veritas forum and to be with Alister McGrath. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, attended a public high school there, and I had interest in both the science and the arts. I had two sets of friends, those who relished their math homework and liked clear, crisp answers to things. And then my art friends who wrote poetry and were part of the literary magazine and loved ambiguity. I wanted to relate a couple of experiences that sort of show where I am. I had a homemade laboratory, and one of the things that I built were pendulums, and I did this by attaching fishing weights to the end of strings. And I read in Popular Science or some other magazine that the time for a pendulum to make a complete swing was proportional to the square root of the length of the string. And with a stopwatch and a ruler, I verified this wonderful law. And I didn't see any reason to believe in anything supernatural, to believe in anything that couldn't be quantified and reduced to these square roots that I was finding. But then another experience I had years later gave me a different view of the cosmos. I was lying very late at night. I was lying on my back in a boat out in the ocean. There was no one near me, and I was looking up at the stars. It was a very clear night. I had turned the engine off, so it was quiet. And after a while, I felt like I was falling into infinity. I felt like I was merging with something much larger than myself, that I was connected to the entire cosmos. And I think that you could have connected every one of my 100 billion neurons to a giant computer and read out all of the electrical and chemical impulses, and it would not have distilled that experience that I had, that feeling of connection to the cosmos. And so I consider myself to be a spiritual materialist. I do think that the universe is made up of atoms and molecules, and there is no supernatural essence beyond that. But I also feel like we're connected to something larger than ourselves. There's some kind of grand order, and that we have these experiences like the kind that I had in the boat looking up at the stars, these transcendent experiences which are not reducible to zeros and ones. So that's why I call myself a spiritual materialist. So that's my little introduction.
Yeah, thank you. Alister, I'd love to hear yours sort of as your own, but even mapped on a little bit to that, because you both share this, I think, quite rare hybrid, both interests and I would say sort of integrity of questions that have a scientific domain and that have a different kind of domain. Some might call it humanist, some might call it transcendent. And I would just love to hear your echo or your own story vis-a-vis what Alan just shared.
Well, thank you, Anne, and hi, I'm Alister, and I'm in Oxford, and it's really good to be with you. And actually, something Alan said really resonated with me very strongly, because I remember as a boy, looking at the night sky and just being overwhelmed by this, and building a little telescope to look at the planets and the moon, and just feeling A, I could possibly understand this, but B, there's something so big here. It's almost as if it's a gateway to something I don't really understand. And that made me want to be a scientist, because I felt I wanted to understand this. So I specialized in science at high school. And I was an atheist at that time. I took the view that, if you were into science, you couldn't have anything to do with religion. And then I went to Oxford to study chemistry. And then I began to really do two things. One was to encounter incredibly articulate Christians who were able to say, look, science and faith aren't incompatible. You've got it wrong. But also in our first year chemistry course, we did a lot on theoretical chemistry. And one of the people we were forced to study, and actually I was forced to, but it was a pleasure, was to actually read Einstein. And I began to realize Einstein was complex and very, very interesting. And Einstein seemed to have this idea that there was science, there was religion. Actually, you could hold these together. You could do things with them. And that was an eye-opener. So I would describe myself as a scientist who is a believing Christian, and is just aware that actually it's very, very hard to give simple answers to life's big questions because they're so complicated. But nevertheless, we can have a go. We can try and make sense of things. I did a doctorate in the biological sciences. Then I switched to theology and tried to figure out how to hold science and religion together, which is why I hold this chair at Oxford in these things. But I'm really looking forward to our conversation, because I think it's going to be really interesting.
You both, thank you. You both sort of have embodied, even just in what you described, lifetimes of sort of seeking and a willingness to, I would say, sort of a quest for truth. You could say that's a capital T or a lowercase t. Lifelong learners, to put it sort of in lay language. And I'm curious, insofar as you might nod along to that, how you would reflect on what has wound up as you look back on things that have been immovable convictions you've had, or revelations of this is a natural law, or this is a truth. What has proven to be sort of bedrock and core and immovable? And then what kinds of questions continue to be very alive for you? How would you think about that? Alister, we'll start with you.
Well, that is a really good question. What is absolute bedrock for me is this is a fascinating and very strange universe, which I don't really understand properly, but I sense we can make a degree of sense of it, but not complete sense. And one of the questions I'm wrestling with is, well, how do I fit into this? I'm here observing this, thinking about this. Is that significant? What's this all about? And trying to take this core conviction, there is this real world, I'm here observing it, and then at the same time feeling there are things I can't prove, things that are very exciting, which might be that there's something meaningful here. There's not just a question of existing here, but actually we can understand how the universe works. We can also try and figure out what it means and what we mean, and therefore finding a meaningful place in this world. So if you like, that's a little bit more tentative, but it's very important, because we do need more than simply understanding how things work. We need to figure out how we fit into this and what we're here to do and that kind of thing. So I kind of think we need a stereoscopic vision, if you like. Science helps us to understand how things work, and we need to also understand what they mean, what we mean. And I'm not sure science really helps us to give those answers, although it can help us point in certain directions. So I try to hold these things together. It's a wonderful world, but a complicated one, and somehow we can make some degree of sense of it and figure out what we're meant to be doing within it.
Yeah, thank you. Alan, how would you reflect on that? The sorts of, either they can be events, recurring realities in your own work or in the world, sort of perpetual contradictions you run into. What kinds of things have tended to return you to questions you've really been asking your whole life?
Well, picking up on something that Alister said, I think the preciousness of life in the universe is something that strikes me. The fraction of matter in the universe that it's in living form is like one grain of sand on the Gobi Desert. If we assume that the Earth is typical of what fraction of life is in the biosphere on Earth, and we extrapolate that to the universe as a whole, life is very, very rare in terms of materiality. I mean, I said a little bit earlier that I'm a materialist, but what does it mean that life is so rare. Does that connect us to other living things out there in the cosmos? They're bound to be other living beings out there, but and they probably would also recognize that life is very, very rare. So this makes me feel connected not only to other human beings on Earth, but to living beings elsewhere in the cosmos that I will never meet. And as living things, as this very rare special arrangement of atoms and molecules that makes life, do we have a special obligation as observers of this strange place that we find ourselves in, with all of these strange events? I also think that meaning is something that has no universal answer. I don't think there's any cosmic meaning. I believe that each one of us has to find meaning in our own lives. I used to think that meaning could be attached to only things that lasted a very long time. But I have come to realize, both as a scientist and as a student of Buddhism, that everything is impermanent, that nothing lasts, even the plays of Shakespeare and the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, those are not going to last. And so I think, for me personally, I have to look to the moment for meaning. I think being present in the moment and really appreciating each moment is where meaning lies for me. One more thing, in terms of my core beliefs, and if I go into the ethical realm, I think different cultures have different views of what is ethical and moral behavior. But one rule that seems to be universal, the only rule that seems to be universal, is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And I found that has been my guide for moral and ethical behavior.
Alister, I'd love to have you respond a bit to that. Alan, as you're talking, a good friend of mine recently said he was expressing some frustration with a certain kind of religious imagination that begins with the answers first, and then sort of trying to make the world fit into those answers, whether you want to call that doctrine or dogma or whatever. And he just said, he's a philosopher, and he just said, reality is a question. When are people going to learn to just deal with reality as a question? And that sort of stuck with me. And so I was curious, Alister, just hearing what Alan just said, this notion meaning doesn't have a universal answer. How do you respond to that, or how does that strike you?
I think Alan's made a very good point, because there's no single answer to what is meaning. We all, in effect, discover an answer that we feel, A, works for us. That's very important. But B, actually isn't just something we've made up. We feel that there are reasons for getting to this. And the reality I think I'm thinking about is suffering. I mean, that's on our agenda tonight. I don't like suffering. I don't like it when other people are suffering. So obviously one of the questions I'm trying to figure out is how on earth we can find meaning in suffering, not simply in terms of providing some kind of rationalization of this, but actually saying, well, look, it's there. What are we going to do about it? Can we do something in the situation? There's some way if we can find meaning and enact meaning in this situation. So for me, that's actually really a very important thing. I mean, from a Christian perspective, it's very important to me that Christ suffered. He wasn't an armchair philosopher who just said, hey, this is the way things are. It's much more, he embraced it, and in some way, that actually is about, if Christ is who Christians think he is, then actually that is saying something very special, that in effect, God knows what it's like to suffer. And I think that is a very important insight that I find very important. For example, when I pray, I don't have to say, now, dear God, let me just tell you about this thing called suffering, because you don't know about it. In fact, we're able to say, look, I think you do know about this. It's not very nice, but I know you're here somewhere. And so that's one way I would think about meaning here, is to say that while I don't understand why suffering is here, I think I can cope with it Because not just understanding, it's coping. That's a really important point. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But also it helps me figure out what I should be doing to try and engage this reality of suffering, trying to do what I can to make it less than it presently is.
Well, on that sort of suffering theme, let's get into this, and we're going to talk about it, or I'd like to talk about it in a few different ways, in part reflecting each of your own backgrounds, professionally, but also personally. You know, as already mentioned, and as we all get millions of emails stating to us, 2020 has been a very memorable year, even if we don't remember every day, because time has been so slippery. There's been COVID, there's been a massive racial reckoning in the West, natural disasters, I think a broader awakening to just profound divisions and worldview inside particular polities. And, you know, whenever this kind of upheaval happens, I think the very human question arises of why. But as I've sort of been thinking about that question myself this year and heard others have conversations around why, even if they don't quite articulate it in that way, it's occurred to me that there's maybe more than two, but at least as I can think of it, sort of two distinct pathways inviting us into the question of why. There is what I might call sort of the scientific why, which is a why often of correlation and causative explanation. And then there's a more existential why, which is one of purpose and moral meaning, and perhaps even a sort of a creational order of some who or divine force or whatever, having some kind of oversight. In the Christian tradition, you would say sovereignty. So I'm just curious if you could each reflect on these sort of two different flavors of hunger for sense making and meaning making, from where you each sit. So Alan, we'll start with you. Like, how do we think scientifically about the course of events in a year like the one we're ending, and also sort of human agency in that? Does science speak to that dynamic?
Well, let's talk about COVID, since that's what we're going through right now. COVID, of course, is transmitted by a virus, which has a little bit of DNA and RNA in it, and corrupts the DNA of our cells and causes the sickness. DNA is actually a good thing overall. It has been developed, this particular molecule emerged as one that could store information and could produce advanced organisms. So if it weren't for DNA and the magical properties of DNA, the ability to store a lot of information, distinguish between different human beings, we wouldn't have advanced life forms, we wouldn't have people. Well, it's inevitable, and the DNA was produced over millions of years by lots of random processes, natural selection. It's inevitable that in those random processes, it's inevitable that you would produce viruses that also operated with DNA and had developed to attach themselves to other DNA. So this is a case where you start with a good thing, and inevitably it leads to certain negative consequences. And so you probably couldn't have the life that we have without having the negative consequences. This is actually a statement that it resonates with a statement that was made by both St. Augustine, representing the Christian faith, and Maimonides, representing the Jewish faith, that God makes good things and only good things, and bad things, the absence of good things. So that seems to have a resonance with my sort of scientific explanation of why we inevitably have viruses. Also, the easy transportation of viruses, which is a big part of the pandemic spread, is because of our global transportation. That also is basically a good thing because it's related to commerce, communion between different countries, and trade, and so on. That is another case of where a basically good thing has inevitable consequences, which are not so good.
Right.
Did you want me to go on and talk about the agency, or should we stop here and let Alister talk?
Yeah, we'll put a comma here and let Alister go. Just so I'm clear, though, translating a little what you were saying scientifically, Alan. So you're part of one thing you're saying is like part of like even who I am and sort of how my whole like system is wired. Like there's elements to who we are as human beings in our flesh, et cetera, today that are a result of viruses shifting things over history. So we are different today than we would have been if certain viruses hadn't happened. Is that a little bit
Or
what you're saying?
certainly, yes, and certainly the genetic basis of viruses,
Right.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you really can't have one without the other, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Alister, yeah, I'd love to hear you sort of expand on this, and feel free to weave in sort of this scientific kind of why question with more of a maybe theological or
Yeah, thank you.
religious
Yes.
imagination.
I mean, Alan said some wonderful things. I mean, you know, I heard someone describe viruses as being evil, and I thought to myself, look, we know we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for viruses in the past. It's as simple as that. And viruses are just viruses. They're natural, and we have to learn to live with them. I think what's really interesting is the deeper existential questions which have arisen from this. And obviously, one of them is the problem of suffering, which we're going to be engaging with more in due course. But there's another one, and it's quite deep. And it's this. It's a very deep fear that we're not in control. That in effect, something is happening which we, you know, a highly technological culture, aren't sure how to deal with. And, you know, and certainly in the United Kingdom, I'm sure in the United States as well, there was panic at one point where we began to realize this is out of control. You know, we can't stop it. And I think that really frightened people because it made us realize that perhaps we had got overconfident. Perhaps we'd failed to realize that actually this is quite a risky world, and that we're not quite as invulnerable as we thought we were. Maybe we need to do a lot of rethinking. And interestingly, a lot of my friends went back to earlier periods in history, and of course there were massive outbreaks of plague. I mean, for example, we all think of Isaac Newton discovering, well, thinking about the laws of gravity with the apple falling. What we very often forget is the reason he was in his mother's garden watching the apple fall is it had to leave Cambridge because of an outbreak of the plague. You know, in effect, it was well known in those days. So I think there's a deeper existential question. We almost feel this is not just about an inconvenience, something we've got to deal with. It's about actually, it's raising questions about, are we actually in control? And of course, the unspoken fear, I suppose, is maybe we'll be able to deal with this viral outbreak. What's next?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think this is all really quite sobering. And actually, maybe it's good for us to think about these things. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think Veritas is so good. It helps us to think about these questions.
Yeah.
Do we need to realize that perhaps we aren't quite the masters of our world that we thought we were? And that, I think, might just help us to induce a degree of humility, which might be a very good way of thinking about this. So there are these deeper questions, and I think it's very good to explore them and realize that actually we have done some wonderful things, but actually we are vulnerable, and we have to face up to that, raising deep questions about whether actually we are not quite as secure in our place in this world as we once thought we were.
You know, it's funny. I find scientists to be among the most contagiously curious people that you can meet. More curious than journalists, which is more my profession. And yet there is a logic of controls holding, and obviously controls and variables. And you're hearing my 7th grade science cap speaking, but. Alan, could you reflect a bit on what Alister was just saying about I mean, he's bringing up an existential fear that we're not in control, and the awareness we've all been sort of shocked into this year, despite all of our technology and modern developments and sense of being on top of the world. But how does the scientific imagination and or disposition have room for that question, or the possibility that actually there's a whole lot we don't control?
Well, I think Alistair makes an excellent point, and I think that probably, and I think it exists in the psychological domain as well as the scientific domain. That I think that what frightens us most about the pandemic is that, at least in the early stages, we felt like we didn't have much control. I mean, now with the recent announcements of Pfizer and Moderna, which I have to admit, I always had confidence that biologists would come up with a vaccine, but it does appear that we're getting some control. But as Alistair said, we don't know what's coming down the pike, and inevitably there will be more. And I think of this lack of control also when we have these massive hurricanes and tornadoes that kill so many people. And is Mother Nature really a friendly mother? You know, throughout history, we've had this sense that Mother Nature is this loving entity that will take care of us, but yet Mother Nature creates hurricanes and volcanoes and other things. And it's very frightening to think that Mother Nature actually has no purpose, that there's not a two-way conversation there with Mother Nature, that it's a one-way conversation, and that Mother Nature really is just is. It just is what it is. The world is what it is. And we would like to think that there is someone taking care of us or looking over us or protecting us. Scientists would like to think that they will ultimately be able to control everything. And I think that we're learning that none of those things are true. I do like what Alistair said, that a dose of humility is a good thing. And so it might not be so bad if we get knocked back a notch or two every once in a while by Mother Nature. Yeah. And come to see of ourselves as privileged visitors in this strange cosmos.
Yeah. Alistair, do you have anything to add to that? That was a profound point about the one-way versus two-way street with Mother Nature.
I very much like Alan's emphasis on humility. I thought that was really helpful, because we have been a little bit arrogant in the past. You know, we understand nature, and very often, you know, understanding something is a prelude to controlling it. You know, you understand how it works, and that means you take control. And I think we're being reminded that actually we aren't able to control things quite as much as we thought we could. And also, I mean, I'm very old-fashioned. I loved science simply because it helped us to understand things. That was good enough for me. I mean, the actual ability to do things that came afterwards. And I sometimes wonder, you know, have we in effect lost sight of an original vision, which is the sheer delight of understanding our world, which so often becomes, let's understand it, because then we can take charge and make it do what we want to, except it seems to have gone a bit wrong here.
Yeah. No, I mean, among other things, even just speaking to all you college students out there, it'll be very interesting to see how important institutions that form people of variety of disciplines for future careers, et cetera, learn almost how to do more what jazz does, which is sort of learn how to create in the midst of great unknown. And this is something I'm sort of watching to see as we have become more aware of how little we can master and pull the strings of this year. So moving into this, like really getting into, the most sort of serious subject of the night and of the year, suffering broadly understood. I was just curious, thinking about each of you both as people who are deeply humanistic and really honor the sciences and have an appreciation for mystery, and in your case, Alistair, a faith. I think the older people get, they say, you can suffer your way to wisdom in many different ways, and obviously at different life stages. And there's a C.S. Lewis, who probably many of you watching would be familiar with, it's famously said, he wrote two very different books about technically the same subject. And one was The Problem of Pain, which he wrote as a scholar. And the other was A Grief Observed as a Widower, which he wrote after his wife died. That's when he was widowed. And the first was very erudite and detached, and it's a wonderful philosophical volume. But the second was very personal and searing, and at times not incoherent, but just very raw. And you could sort of just see the cost of love lost. And so, just using that as sort of an example, when a society is healthy and well functioning, society can ideally be shared, at least somewhat. But in the context of our sort of present commons, at least in the US, and I think the UK probably has its own cast here, a lot of people feel sort of splitting apart at the seams. And then add COVID's own sort of discriminatory cast. It's killing some more than others. Some people in certain demographic groups are getting more than others, et cetera. To say nothing of just the isolating effects of social distancing. We see this sort of like panoply of human pain that's really uneven. And we're divided from each other's experiences in all of this. So I give that as a runway to ask each of you how you think about suffering, and in this year, the very uneven experience of suffering. How do you think about that in the context of this notion of control, and then sort of moving into this context of, the age-old question of theodicy? How does a good God allow suffering? Alister, why don't we start with you? Just this relationship between unequal suffering and a God overseeing it.
Well, you've asked some great questions. So this is just the beginnings of an answer to the first part. I mean, I don't like suffering. I don't like it when other people suffer, but suffering is there. And, we've got to face up to this brute reality. It is there. And the question is not simply how we can make sense of it, which we can do, of course, at a biological level or a theological level. It's a deeper question, which is how do we cope with this? And even more than that, can we actually not just cope with this, but grow through this? And I think this is, for me, one of the really interesting questions that emerges from COVID, because the question I find myself asking, me is, how can I become a better person as a result of this? That to me is a very important challenge. And you've raised, I think, a very good question, which is COVID has exposed inequality. If you like, it's a lens which has really shown us that there are certain groups of people, those who live very tightly and closely together, those who don't have access to healthcare, who actually really are feeling the pain a lot more than others. So if you like, our structures have made this worse. And that's a very unsettling thought. But of course, you want me to talk a bit about how I bring God into this, because I think that's really the big item on the agenda. And I think what I would say is this, that obviously we could talk of this in purely philosophical terms, an all-powerful, all-loving God, but I'm kind of very suspicious of these philosophical absolutizations. I think very often they're very abstract. And what I want to say is really, from a Christian perspective, it's almost as if you're focusing on Christ and saying, look, he suffered, he really went through it. And actually, we can take hope from that. There's a certain sense in which the early Christians, for example, suffered quite a lot, had a rough deal, but they saw Christ as someone who would stay with them during their suffering. And so for me, I'm very happy to talk about the intellectual side of things, but it's that's part of it, but it's not the only thing. It's a sense that you are not alone in suffering, that in effect you are walking, if you like, to quote from Psalm 23, with a God who is present with you even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And that's not about evading big issues. It's about saying, I'm not on my own. Because I'm being accompanied and comforted, I can begin to do things. I can be an agent who tries to do something to help those who are suffering, and perhaps also make this world a better place. So there is a theoretical question here, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But there's also a question about, how we rise to the challenge that we are being confronted with this. And for me, actually, that's a really interesting question. It's not just about knowledge of why this is here, it's about wisdom, which is a different kind of knowledge, about how we act wisely to try and learn from this and try to, in effect, ask, what has COVID exposed about us as people and about our society that we might pay attention to? I think that's a very interesting question, which I don't think it's going to go away. But that's just the beginnings of an answer to a very good question.
Thank you. Alan, how do we rise to the challenge of COVID in particular?
Well, first of all, I think that of course the suffering is terrible, and but one can look at some positive aspects of the suffering, and one of them is that it has, as Alister said, it has shined a light on the inequalities, the gender inequality, because women are suffering more, whether they get the virus or not. They're suffering economically more than men. Racial inequalities. We're more attuned to these inequalities now because of COVID, and that's a positive thing because it means that we might begin to address them with greater vigor. I also think that there's a bonding that occurs, that we're all suffering in some kind of a way. Even those who don't have COVID, we're suffering economically and sort of psychically. And there's a bonding that occurs between people who are going through the same experience, like members of the same football team, or soldiers who fight together in a battle. There's a bonding that occurs. But there's something else that's more subtle, which I think is also a positive outcome, and that is that the COVID has forced us to slow down. Even those of us who are still working remotely, and the students who are taking their classes remotely, our lives are slower now. And I think that the slowness gives us a rare opportunity to stop and think about who we are and what our values are and what's important to us. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, life has been speeding up and speeding up and speeding up. In the 1830s, with the telegraph, the speed of communication was 3 bits per second. And then when the internet first came out in the 1980s, it was 1,000 bits per second. And now it's 1 billion bits per second. We've just been rushing around so fast that we haven't had time to think about where we're going and what our values, and not only as an individuals, but as a country as a whole. And I think that being forced to slow down, which the pandemic has done, is one of the few silver linings. The last question was, of course, the very, very difficult question is how can a compassionate God permit suffering? And I'll just say a few words about that. It's a really difficult question. Of course, it depends partly on what your definition of God is, but I do not view God as a controller. And in Genesis 26, God says to Isaiah, when you settle in your new land, I'll be with you. God doesn't say, I will take care of you, I will prevent suffering. God says, I will be with you. And the way that I interpret that is that God gives us the strength to deal with whatever comes our way. I mean, that's how we rise to the most dignified and majestic level that we can be, is to have the strength to deal with adversity. And even the Buddhists say that every experience, including adverse experiences, are opportunities for growth and learning. So I don't mean to at all minimize the terrible suffering that we have gone through. But I think that, as Anne suggested and as Alister said, I agree that it does offer us some opportunities for growth.
There's a Old Testament scholar who you both may know of, Walter Brugerman, and he's been controversial in some circles. And I quote him here, and this may upset if there's any diehard like Calvinist Christians watching. I may upset you by saying this, so forgive me. But said something about this year. He said something about this year. To your point about kind of relinquishing control and humility and this notion of slowness, slowing down. And I think there's a Jesuit who once said, slow is real, which I've been reflecting on this year. That especially I think in Western post-Enlightenment and post-industrial societies, the Christian world in particular has really emphasized a God of control with a particularly kind of Western, maybe even super scientific understanding of what that control means. And, sovereignty is a mystery, and control really, I think in the sense of God's control, can be a mystery. But Brugerman says it would be really nice if we sort of revisited the idea that was much more sort of intrinsic to the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, of God really being a God of sort of that our relationship with God is one of a relationship of fidelity. So it's like a very different optic than thinking about control. So I'm just planting that out there, something you both prompted. But just to wrap up our time before we turn to questions, you both have sort of invoked this notion of humility, and I think recognizing that no one of us, of course, has all the answers. In some ways, probably more often than not, this is maybe a time to just crystallize our questions that are being revealed to us as we look at our society and ourselves in a more clear-eyed way. And when I hear the phrase, we are not alone, I do think of human solidarity. And I'm just curious, I guess it's a two-part question here. Is there a relationship necessarily between human solidarity and the existence of God, or God of love? First question. You can pick which one of these you want to answer. And then the second, more practically, just what can solidarity look like as we head into a winter, most of us being as distanced as we were back in March and April, physically from each other, especially as I think about these students, studying on their own somewhere. What are creative ways in which solidarity might yet be possible? So you can pick either one of those. Whoever wants to go first. Alister?
I'll have a go. I think one of the things I've noticed about the COVID crisis is that, as here, I'm seeing people on small screens. I'm not actually seeing them in the flesh. And what I've noticed is how much human relationality depends actually on being able to be present with, to touch, to kind of hear somebody's voice face to face. And it's really brought home to me actually how important relationships are. And of course, again, if you're a Christian, this idea of a relationship with God, not just knowing about, but somehow, even though it's a very difficult idea to express, knowing and being known by, it's just so important. And it's all about really feeling that we aren't on our own, that there are others around us, but there's also something bigger. And for me, as a Christian, it's in effect being able to say there is some personal reality behind the universe, even though I know it's sometimes difficult to put that into words. But that actually, in one sense, it energizes me, because one of the things that I didn't mention earlier, which I think is just worthwhile mentioning here briefly, is that one of the things that suffering does is it causes us to doubt whether there's a coherence to the world. Is there no meaning? Or is there actually a meaning that's difficult to discern? And I think that's a very important point, because it is in talking to other people that very often we are helped to find our way to these answers. Here is how I cope with suffering. Does that help you? And for me, the idea of walking through a difficult yet beautiful world in the presence of someone who knows me and who I know actually is very, very powerful in terms of energizing me and making me want to do something about things. So I think that's helpful to the creation of human solidarity as well. But there's a lot more to be said, and I want to hear what Alan's going to say, because he said some very interesting things.
Alan? Go ahead.
Well, I want to, first of all, I agree with what Alister said. There's no substitute for in-person contact. But I wanted to say what's happened to me in the last few months in my relative isolation is that I have reached out to friends that I haven't seen in many years over Zoom. And it has made me feel, even though it's, a poor substitute for in-person conversation or touching, it's a lot better than nothing. And I think that if COVID had not occurred, I would not have reached out to these friends. I'm 71 years old. It's very possible that they and I would reach the end of our lives without ever seeing each other again. And yet, because of the feeling of being isolated, of needing this human connection, I have reached out to them. Of course, they were shocked to hear from me, but delighted, and set up Zoom calls with quite a number of my friends that I haven't seen in some cases decades, and reestablish some kind of contact. And I think that's a wonderful thing, not because I did it, but just in its own right, it's a wonderful thing. And so I do think that there's something beneficial about going through this experience that we're all going through. We've listed a number of things. It's highlighted inequalities between races and genders. It's slowed down things, so it gives us the time to think. It bonds us together through a common experience, and it also has made us want to reach out in whatever means are available, even if it's Zoom, to touch other people. It sort of is restating and reestablishing for us the importance of human contact.
Well, on that note, thank you both. I'm going to turn to a form of virtual contact with our audience. We have some great questions that have come in here. And I'm going to start with this one. This is a little bit more getting into the theological side of things. How can a Christian be sure that the divine exists and that his or her faith isn't just an elaborate form of self-deception? Alister, I'm going to kick that one to you. And then Alan, if you just want to reflect honestly on that, that would be great.
Well, I think this is a great question. So let's begin by thanking the anonymous questioner. How can I be sure? We can't be sure about any beliefs that really matter. I can't be sure there is a God. When I was an atheist, I thought I could be sure there is no God, but then realized actually it's not that simple. And for me, the dilemma we face as human beings is that really important beliefs about justice, about identity, about whether there's a God or not, what our moral values are, you can't prove these are right. You have to learn to live with uncertainty. And indeed, wisdom is about realizing that you have to, in effect, say, I cannot prove this is right. Here are the reasons why I think it's right, but I can't prove it. I'm going to embrace this way of living and thinking and see where it takes me. So to the answer to the question, can I be sure? No. But there's a deeper question. Can any of us be sure about the really big beliefs in life? No, we can't. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm a great fan of the Oxford philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin. He says, look, we cannot prove beliefs that really matter. So we draw from that conclusion, we ought to treat other people with respect, because it means that, in effect, because we can't treat them as idiots. They've arrived at these ideas, we assume by good processes, we have to treat people with respect. And I think that's very important. So what I'm saying to the questioner is that I'm being absolutely honest. I cannot prove there is a God. I cannot prove that Christianity is right. But when I was an atheist, I could not prove that was right either. We have to make a step of faith in embracing any worldview. And that's just the way things are. And I think that I'm quite old now, that's one of the few pieces of wisdom I've gathered during the course of my life, I think.
Thank you. Alan?
Well, I would like to say something to complement what Alister said, and I think that he stated it beautifully. That just as we cannot prove the existence of God, that we have to accept God or reject God as a matter of faith, we also can't prove the central doctrine of science, which is that the universe is a lawful place, and that the Newton's laws of motion that we find here, that they apply everywhere and at every time in the universe. We can't prove that. All the theories that we have in science that have worked so well in the past, we can't be sure that tomorrow there won't be an experiment that will contradict one of those theories. And so every scientist, and this is something that I did as a graduate student in physics, you just accept the central doctrine of science as a matter of faith. And that central doctrine is that the universe is a lawful place, a rational place. But you have to take that doctrine as a matter of faith. It cannot be proven. And I find it very interesting that some of these very deep questions, like does God exist, or is the universe completely lawful, are questions that we cannot answer, that we have to come to an understanding of as a matter of faith.
So this, somewhat following off that, although this question presumes, and it's the most popular one, so I am going to ask it, it presumes that this has been a very rigorous debate, which I'm not sure it has been a debate per se, more of just a rich discussion, but this is to both of you. What is the one argument or perspective on the other side that you find the most persuasive and compelling, and why? So we might translate that in the contours of this discussion as a perspective that maybe comes from priors that you don't yourself share, but somehow the way they were expressed tonight, you found yourself sort of either curious about or assenting to. Either one of you want to take a whack at that?
Well, it's hard to answer that because we didn't really have a debate, and I don't think that there were definitely two opposing sides here. We probably agreed on too much for an interesting conversation.
Well, let me look at one question, which I think might lie behind this. And I guess the questioner perhaps feels that I, as a Christian, ought to have engaged more with the question of, why is there suffering there anyway? Surely this world could be made in a different way so there isn't suffering. So if that's the question behind the question, I think it does require an answer. I think, let me begin to open this up, because I think it just is interesting. When I was much younger, I used to think, look, there's suffering in this world, therefore there is a problem. But David Hume, who makes this point in one of his dialogues, would say, look, there has to be a better universe, which in effect means we look at this one and say, well, hey, it's lousy, who made this sort of thing? And I think my concern here is we just don't have the comparator. We don't have, I've got a pen here. This is one that doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it's lousy, but I've got a pen that does work, and I can compare the pen that doesn't work with the pen that does work. But Hume seems to be assuming that actually we know there is a better possibility, and therefore wonder why we don't have it here. And I think I'm just very suspicious of that. The thing that really puzzles me, and again, this may be the question behind the question, is why do I feel that suffering isn't just kind of a bit anomalous? Actually, it's wrong. It's unjust. There's something much deeper. It's a deeper reaction than that. And what I wonder is, where does that come from? Within my worldview, how do I explain it? I think I could, it's this deep sense that it's not meant to be like this, and I need to help do something about it. But I often think that the whole debate about suffering and God rests on a whole lot of very questionable assumptions where we think we know something, and in fact, we don't really. So that may be part of the problem here.
This is a very good question. What I'm about to ask from an anonymous person in the audience. If you could solve the problem of pain, would you? Alister, I will ask you to take a.
Okay, well, hi, anonymous person. The answer is I would love it if we could solve pain. Here's the deeper part of my answer. But what would the price tag be? Because my concern is that we're all very familiar with the law of unintended consequences, whereby you do something and then realize that in doing that, you mess a whole lot of other things up and things are worse than they were. And what I'm worried about is that, I would love to be able to abolish pain. It would make life a lot easier. Admittedly, there would be difficulties, like if you have no pain sensation, you are very vulnerable to all kinds of things. But my feeling is that it would be lovely if we had a world without pain, but I fear to think what the price tag would be. And that is a real concern to me. So it's not an easy answer to give. I personally would much prefer it if there wasn't pain. But what I wonder is, are we simply talking about the world in which there are relative degrees of pain? And actually, maybe in Western culture, we're experiencing a lot less pain than others do in the emerging world. And I think that if I can put it like this, it sounds a very silly answer, I know, but I think it might be selfish of me to want to do that. Because I think an awful lot of people are much more badly affected by this than me. And to get rid of pain properly, we are looking not at some kind of tinkering with human mechanisms. We're talking about making this world a more just place. And that's a much bigger and much more uncomfortable agenda, which isn't going to go away.
Alan, how would you think about that, the erasure of the problem of pain?
Well, I like what Alistair said, that it depends on what the price tag is. I mean, you can take a lot of morphine and knock yourself out and kill all your pain, but then you don't have any awareness. You're not really living in the world. So the price tag is an important consideration. But I wanted to make another comments related to that. It's not exactly the same. And this is something that I've always wondered about. And that is, if we look at all of the great art that has been created, and music and painting, and novel writing, most of it has come out from people who were suffering in some way. Great art seems to come out of sadness more than joy. And I don't know exactly why that is. I don't have an answer to that. But somehow, and I'm not speaking necessarily of physical suffering, emotional suffering. There are many ways to be sad. But somehow the experience of suffering and sadness brings something deep out of us that can be a creative force. It's not all negative. And we've seen that creative force in some of the responses to COVID. Very near the beginning of COVID, I think it was in March, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra had a performance. They had like 25 musicians who were all sequestered in their own homes, but they played together, and they played their part for some symphony or I can't remember, I think it was a symphony. And there was a central computer and a technician that combined all of the individual sounds and made this really breathtaking symphony. There have been other creative things that have come out of the COVID experience. So I don't have an answer. I don't know why, but it does seem to be the case that creative activity often comes out of suffering and sadness.
Thank you. This question comes in from a Roger who asks, if meaning is derived from humans, what basis is used? Ultimate meaning must have a transcendent agent, right? Otherwise, good and bad can be upside down. I'm Alister, we'll go with you again.
Roger, that's a very good question. I think my view is that I could easily make up a worldview which I liked, which I thought was right, which in effect resonated with everything I wanted to be and to do. But I would have this deep fear, it's a bit like Freud and wish fulfillment, that somehow I'd simply, in effect, developed a worldview, a theory of meaning that orbited around me as an individual. And I think initially I did that. I mean, I was really quite arrogant as a teenager. And then I began to realize there are two things here. Number one, I cannot make myself the center of the universe. There's a bigger perspective. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why, for me, believing in God helps you decenter yourself. It's saying, look, you aren't. Wake up to this fact. You need to realize you are part of something much bigger than yourself, and you cannot determine meaning simply by how it affects you and what you want. You have to ask, how do I fit into a bigger picture in which I have responsibilities? So for me, we end up using the language of transcendence, which I could easily extrapolate to God. But I'd certainly want to say that meaning is about realizing that there is something beyond me. It's not something I've invented. It's something I've, if you like, discovered and embraced, even if it's costly. So that's how I begin to respond to that. I think it's a very perceptive question, if I might say so, because my own view, and again, I must make it clear, this is just the way I see it, and I may not be right, is that it is very difficult to construct a theory of meaning which is not self-centered unless you have a reference point beyond you, something that's transcendent. God does the job very well, but there may be other possibilities as well. But for me, God does that job.
Thank you. So I'm gonna, we have a few questions that have come in that they're a little more personal to each of you. So I'm gonna risk that, not knowing you either until tonight. But I think they're both sort of honoring of each of your own sort of journeys and ongoing journey as human beings. So this first one is to you, Alan. Dr. Lightman, how can you be so sure that your experience on the boat was something that could not be measured?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that you could, it really comes down to the question of consciousness. I mean, that's, how do we measure consciousness? And consciousness is one of the greatest mysteries in both neuroscience and philosophy. That even though biologists, and I agree with this, think that the brain is all material, that it's made up of neurons that have connections and they have chemical contact with each other, and then there's electrical currents that go through individual neurons. We know, we think of the brain as a material thing, and yet the experience of consciousness is something so sui generis, so unique, so overpowering, that no one has ever been able to understand it in terms of just the operations of neurons, even if we think that somehow it originates with neurons. We just haven't been able to understand qualitatively what consciousness is, what I-ness is, what ego is. And so that's why I say that I don't think that the experience of looking up at the stars and feeling connected to them can be reduced to just the electrical and chemical flows between neurons, because we don't understand what consciousness is. There's a philosopher, I can't remember, Colin McGinn, who wrote a book, The Mysterious Flame, in which he says that there's no way that we will ever be able to understand the mind completely or what consciousness is, but because we can't get outside of our minds to understand what's happening. We are intrinsically trapped within, fundamentally trapped within our own 3 pounds of neurons. So I don't know whether that's a satisfactory answer, but it's a great question. And I do like very much that we call this Q&R instead of Q&A, because a lot of the really deep questions don't have answers. And in my experience of having lived in both the world of science and the world of the arts, I realized that we have to have both kinds of questions with answers and questions without answers, that both kinds of questions are part of what make us human.
Alister, this one is for you. How did you come to Christ from atheism to believing?
Obviously, I was going through a process of thinking and, beginning to realize that I thought atheism was factually correct, that it was evidentially certain, and then beginning to realize it was not that simple, beginning to realize that actually I knew a lot of very intelligent people who took a Christian perspective and a whole series of things. But I'll tell you what the tipping point was. And I'll just try and explain it. When I was an atheist, I used to say something like this: well, look, I'm here in space-time, and if there's a God, he's up in heaven, wherever that is. And so what? I mean, it makes no difference to me at all. And so there was a massive relevance question, if you like, here for me. And then people explained to me about this idea of the incarnation. In other words, that Christ is, in effect, not simply a good religious teacher, but actually is God entered into our human history in human form. And I suddenly realized that that was a game changer, because that meant that God had entered into human history in human form, and that in effect meant he was in space and time. He journeyed with me, not as someone who viewed it from afar. And so for me, that was really transformative. Now, actually, it's very relevant to our discussion tonight, because as I was just saying, if that is so, and obviously it's a Christian belief, it's a very important Christian belief, but I can't prove that it's right, then immediately it says, well, look, Christ suffered. And that means that God knows what that is like. And that's a very big psychological thing, because it means, God knows what I'm going through. And actually that makes it easier to pray, makes it easier to journey when you know there's someone who is sympathetic in the proper sense of the word, who has suffered with, who's been alongside that. So that was the game changer for me. Now, obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but that actually was really quite an important point, which, if you like, tipped me a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you. How do you respond this comes from a Gordon. Thank you, Gordon, for this question. How do you respond in person, practically, spiritually, to those who are experiencing a crisis of suffering? And that's a very big question and probably would depend on the particular suffering, but if you guys have some principles you would follow that could be helpful. Alan, would you like to try that one?
Are we talking about physical suffering or emotional suffering?
Probably both, but why don't we go with emotional?
Yeah. Well, it's related. I mean, it's part of the bigger question. How do you empathize with other people? And I think you listen to them, and you try to put yourself in their shoes. And maybe from that comes understanding. But just the phrasing of the question, the person who posed the question suggests to me that that person has compassion, cares about the suffering of other people. And I think caring and listening is my recipe. I know that's terribly simple, but I don't really think I have much more to offer than that, caring and listening.
Alister, I'm guessing you might not have more to offer than that foundation either. But...
Alan basically has articulated some of the key things. I mean, when you are going through suffering, whether it's physical or emotional, you very often feel very alone. You're on your own. And actually, having somebody who walks with you through that, it helps if they've been through it. I want to make that point clear, but you don't have to. It's just, you recognize there's an issue here, and almost, as an act of human solidarity, you're saying, I want to try and help you in some way. I can walk you for a while, maybe try and help. Then I have to withdraw, I'm afraid. But it's this sense that, there's something that affects all of us. It's a recognition of the human situation. We do suffer physically, we do suffer emotionally. And actually what helps me, what helps others get through this is knowing you aren't on your own. I think that however we do that, and I know it sounds a bit glib and probably a bit superficial, but actually very often people are looking for a lifeline in these situations, just some recognition that they matter to somebody. And actually that can very often be the tipping point to help them move on to the next phase. Like Alan, I don't think we can make a massive difference in terms of what we do really, but nevertheless we can show that there's a real concern here. And sometimes, it does help to share experiences you've been through, just to say, look, you aren't on your own, it's all right. And that to me is something that's really very important. And again, COVID really has meant we know a lot of people like this who are very, very difficult. And the real problem about COVID is because of social isolation, people don't have anyone to talk to. It's a real problem. So I think there's a general problem accentuated by, I think, the COVID crisis.
Yeah. This question, and we may wrap up with this. This question is sort of a cousin to what I just asked. And this person asks, I'm a Christian, but have felt and feel immense psychological suffering. What would you say to a Christian who's in pain, mostly for mental health reasons? I want to give a pause, but do either one of you want to?
Well, I'll come in here, and Alan may want to supplement this. I would want to say that actually there are more people in this situation than you might think. You're not on your own. This is actually a very widespread problem, and it's a lot worse now than it was a year ago. So you need to, in fact, say, look, I'm not on my own. I know it's difficult to meet people. I know it's difficult to have those deep conversations, but there are people there, and there are others going through what you are going through. So really, I'd want to say, look, try and hang in there, because hopefully we'll be able to start talking about these things again. And that may not solve the problems, but it means we can share these things more than might otherwise be the case. And that's just, if you like, a sort of promissory note, a sort of very quick intervention. But, it does need to be said, it's much worse for somebody in that situation now than it was earlier. Hopefully we won't be there all that much longer, but I do very much appreciate what the issue is.
Yeah. Alan, did you want to have anything to add there?
Well, I'm not sure the relationship between us during this period, between one suffering person and another, I don't think that it is specific to being a Christian person. That's what I would say, that whatever our faith is, or even lack of faith, that we're all suffering in some way or another to different degrees, but we're all affected by this. And I think that despite all of the bad aspects of that it does establish a bond between us, like we're all on the same football team or something like that, that we're all, that we have something that we, it's another thing that we share, that human beings share. We're sharing something here. We're all affected. And I think that sharing helps strengthen the bonds between us, whatever our faith.